So we just heard some opinions about the state of data sharing today. And I'd be curious to know what you guys think. And if you could kind of erase the last 15 years, how could we start over? Is there a different model? You know, we saw how there was this need for fintechs to get bank data, and now banks are getting fintech data, and the aggregators kind of filled that gap. They saw that business opportunity, and they're serving that need. Is there a better model that would work? Let's start with you, Phil.
What an interesting proposition, the thought of, can we go back 15 years? What would we do differently? I can ask that in probably every situation in my entire life. I think that the system right now obviously is evolving based on what sort of happened point by point. But if we went back, I think, and huge thanks and congrats to Georgina and what she's built at Solo and sort of the ecosystem that has tried to find the right balance forward, right? We, at the American FinTech Council, we've always thought, and all 5 years that we've been in existence, but for the 5 years we've thought about it is not, one versus the other. It's sort of a collaborative partnership ecosystem where we work together for the benefit of the consumer. Period, full stop. If you ever divert from that focus, you've missed the boat, you've lost the game, right? And I think the focus on how do you build the best partnerships, how do you make sure that you're creating the best collaborations for sharing ultimately for the benefit of the consumer. And so I think there was a gap, right? Going back 15 years, I think there was a gap that provided opportunities for people to fill. And sometimes opportunities don't present the best solutions. They present the solutions that are available in the moment and for those people who take advantage of the opportunities. But that doesn't mean we're stuck with them forever. I took this job at the American FinTech Council almost 3 years ago now because and again, I love talking to Georgina because of the energy, because we're trying to change the world. We're trying to do something a little bit different than maybe we're doing it today. We thought about it more as a fight against traditional banks versus innovative companies. What we recognized was the goal is to put everybody together. Today, about 25% of our membership is actually made up of community banks, innovative community banks, but community banks nonetheless, most below $10 billion. In addition to the fintech companies of all shapes, sizes, and kinds, big logos, little logos, earned wage access, buy now, pay later, fintech lending. I mean, the idea of putting everybody in the same ecosystem works. And so the question, going back to the start of the question, is you take all of the data and all of the information. It doesn't have to be controlled by any one person or any one entity or any small group of entities. We find a mechanism in which we can create a safe, consumer-friendly way to ensure that there is fair, equitable sharing across the ecosystem, and that everybody is doing their part, right? It shouldn't be burdened by any one company, by any one bank, but that the ecosystem sort of lends to a collaboration and a coalition to do what is ultimately the best interest of the consumer. And so I think we're actually at a point today where it doesn't matter if it was 15 years ago or today, we could do the same thing, right? It's a bit harder because there are some incumbents that are more entrenched. There are some new incumbents that are entrenched. Without mentioning any names, the goal is how do we actually now slowly move the system and change it today.
And what would it take to change that? Just standards around the way data is shared, or would there need to be a shared technology infrastructure? Because now we have these pipes that are run by individual companies. How would you undo that control that we have in place now?
So we think about this all the time, and we thought about this going back to fintech lending and bank fintech partnerships. How do you monitor and manage it, right, in the absence of regulatory guidelines, prescribed regulatory guidelines specific to what we're doing? We say all the time at the American FinTech Council that we are a standards-based organization. So we didn't do it because I came up one day and said, here are our new standards, right? We brought all the players together. At the time, it started with fintech lending, with all the major fintech lenders and their bank partners, and said, what are best practices? How do we think about third-party risk management and compliance? And then we did it for buy now, pay later. And then we did it for earned wage access. And I would say earned wage access is the most recent one, where you had 18 diverse companies with diverse business models came together and said, hey, what are the 12 standards that we could sort of present in the absence of regulatory leadership? I think here is no different. You put smart people in a room who are all working towards that same goal that we talked about earlier, and you can actually accomplish something pretty amazing. Now, again, I'm an optimist and I'm an idealist, and I think that we actually have a responsibility to the ecosystem to do this together. But I would say, especially today, and I'll say this over the last 5 years and even longer, I don't think any one entity holds the ownership over or the responsibility to solve the problem. And if any one entity is doing it, then you've lost already, right? If government is doing it for the industry, you've lost. If the industry is doing it for, again, not industry, but like if one sector in the industry is doing it, then you've lost. And if the other and if one company is doing it, you've lost. It only actually works if you're doing it together. Otherwise, it won't last. And we've seen the pendulum swing back and forth, back and forth. Financial services regulation, consumer protections are not something you play with and change every 3 or 4 years or every time there's an administration change. You do it responsibly with the right technologies, with the right databases, with the right players, everybody around a table. And it's going to be ugly. I want to be clear about something. It's not going to be a pretty process, but you walk away, you've actually accomplished something.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything that Phil just said. And I also wanted to go back to 15 years ago and say, if we had a more concerted effort to incentivize data sharing rather than just expect that it would just happen out of thin air, we'd be in a very different place today. And I think Congressman Frank was absolutely right when he said that the key is value add. If we had started out with a value add framework where all the players in the ecosystem understood that when they added value, they were compensated for that, and when they were receiving value, they were paying for that, it would have become a much more expansionary ecosystem rather than a zero-sum ecosystem. And we still have the chance to change that now.
So you feel that people ought to be able to charge for data, and there's different ramifications of that. So should banks be allowed to charge for their data, their customer
We're
data?
going there already. Okay. Do you want to jump in there first? Or?
Go ahead.
So I think that it's obviously that we knew that question was going to come up today, but I think that it presupposes a lot. So I think let's unpack that for a second. It presupposes the status quo, which is that you have these aggregators in the middle who are just routing information from banks to fintechs or to end consumers. And the reality is that there actually isn't one specific role that any company plays just based on what their vertical is. Just because you're a bank, that doesn't mean you're always playing the same role. Just because you're a fintech doesn't mean you're always playing the same role. It should be a transaction-specific structure. So the reason that I don't think that the original 1033 rule was as optimized as it could have been is it wrote all of those rules based on the company vertical. You're a bank, so therefore you do this. You're an aggregator, so therefore you do this. In actuality, we all wear different hats. Just like in some relationships, we're the outgoing one and sometimes we're the shy one. In every single transaction, there's a receiving party and a sending party. The receiving party is the one that's adding value, is the one that's asking for that data. And the sending party is the one that is providing some data. Sometimes they're just providing raw data and they didn't add any value to it. In that case, it should essentially be free or near free. If they have actually added value to it via lineage or via actual work that you've put into it in a credit or fraud underwriting piece or anything like that, then you should be compensated for that. But it could be anyone. A fintech could be a sender or requester. A bank could be a sender or a requester. So if we're going to get down to how do we redo 1033, and I do believe that can be done in the next few months. It sounds like a really big undertaking, but it's not. Is you rip out this, it's banks versus aggregators versus fintechs, and rather it's transactions. In this specific transaction, are you the sending party or the receiving party? And then you create a system for incentivizing data sharing.
I'll just say, because I already said it to you and probably to Kate and probably to probably to Joey, right? Like a consumer, owns his own data and can do with it what he pleases, right? Full stop. That being said, I agree with I absolutely agree. And I think it goes to what I said earlier in terms of like there's an ecosystem that needs. Today, the aggregators have built a technology that unfortunately you couldn't access the data before you had those systems in place, and they came up with it when they did, and they added value to the ecosystem. And so someone delivers value, there should be a mechanism in which they can get compensated for that value add. I think the consumer appreciates that, right? I think the way it's all played out has sort of gotten very convoluted in terms of the consumer probably doesn't know, and everybody was kind of taking advantage of the opportunities that presented themselves. But I think that I agree with you, except for the fact that ultimately I think if the consumer recognizes the value add of each of the parties, they would recognize there should be some mechanism in which the right folks should be compensated in the right way.
That was a lot.
I asked if you wanted to speak.
No, I'm honored to be up here with the two of you and in front of this group. I think, we have a situation that, Phil represents a group of companies that have invested tremendous amounts of money into improving the lives of American citizens from a consumer financial perspective. And there's a lot of great work going on. And there's a tremendous amount of effort underway to put a wedge between banks and fintechs, and that's not healthy, and that's not right. I'll take you back to the pens on the paper when this rule was written, and the intention here was to give the consumer what they deserve, which is the rights and control of their data, and that's a wonderful goal. But if you look at the tens of billions of dollars invested in bank compliance and risk infrastructure, and the amount of contextualization that goes into data that makes it valuable in the marketplace, I think there's an argument that they have to be compensated for that trust value, that trust layer, right? And so I'm not saying they should, but I'm saying that Jamie had every right to say what he said. They're not just going to give their billions of dollars away. In the same way, the consumer created the data through their actions. And they shouldn't give it away either. And so there's a happy medium here, and I don't think we're there yet. One of the things that I remember in the rooms where we used to beat each other up and put Post-it notes on the wall, you remember, and have scrums, is the argument about how this should happen, and I don't think we're there yet. But I do know one thing that we all know, and that is we can't do what the bureaus did and are doing. And I think we have to be mindful of the blatant illegal activities around hoarding consumer data for the benefit of corporate greed in the credit reporting industry. And we have to not recreate that when we're sharing bank transaction data in under 1033. So if we do anything, let's be mindful not to do that. When I built I don't know how many people here know me, but I helped build the complaint space at the CFPB. What does that mean, right? So that means that consumers talk, and I just walked a part of the way here, and there's a lot of people, and they probably have a lot to say, right? And so consumers talk about their experiences with consumer products and services, and the CFPB created an opportunity for them to be able to voice their concerns and then made that information public. The 80% of the complaints, there are 8 million complaints in the CFPB's public database today. 8 million complaints in the government complaint database. No one knows to go to the government. Go out on the street. No one even knows what the CFPB is. And 8 million people found their way there. 80% of those complaints are against the credit reporting companies. 80%. So let's not recreate that model, right? So Representative Frank talked about the battles in trying to control that data, that market, that pricing, the ownership. At least let's not recreate that. And so when data is shared, it should be shared continuously, owned by the consumer, with the ability for recourse the entire way through. And no one should be able to hoard that data along the way. And so I think in those principles, we can do something good here. The majority of your client, your membership, that's how they operate. And so we have an opportunity here to do something really good. We have an example of something that's really, really bad, and we don't want to do that. And so my answer is the rule right or wrong the way it was written? I think we have an opportunity to improve it because we've seen billions of dollars invested chasing the rule, assuming where it's going to land, building infrastructure, and now they want the rule to amend itself to benefit them. Where's the consumer?
Well, yeah, and you're kind of echoing something that Georgina said in the last panel, was that the consumer should have portability throughout like the life of the data. So even if a data aggregator moves data from this company to that company, the consumer should still have control in perpetuity. But I have trouble picturing how that would work. I mean, I know in the UK, I believe the original idea was the consumer could ask for their account data and they could literally get like a zip drive or some kind of like a device with all their data in it, and they could just walk it over to another bank. We don't have that here. And I don't know if we have the technology to do that, do we?
Well, there's several different use cases for open banking. And the one that like the BPI put in their lawsuit would said, oh, well, 1033 was just, saying the law itself was just saying that you could just download a CSV and then that constituted, data sharing. Right? We all know that's not true, right? There's actual ways that you can port your data over to other institutions that can make your life better, and that's what we want to incentivize. And if you have and I'm going to sound like a broken record, I realize that, but if you have a system that rewards lineage and value creation, value add, then all of a sudden institutions and companies of all stripes want to share rather than want to not share. And it flips the whole paradigm on its head. And so therefore, you don't have the situation where we're just bottling it down to, consumers have to like download the CSV and then go around with their data. If they're directing traffic, right? They're the air traffic controller, and we're just flying the planes, making sure they get to the right places. And that's what a better 1033 rule can do.
I'll just say, you have to look at it. Fintech, responsible innovation, democratizes financial services, right? It creates access. And then you think about kind of the biggest players in any ecosystem now saying, we want to control it the same way that we all complained about the banks controlling it, right? I think we have to kind of, the same logic has to carry its way down the line, and we have to create new opportunities to figure it out. I think to your question, and it's funny, I was on a roundtable this afternoon where we were getting examples out of India and Mexico, and there was sort of different examples of someone said, you create a government-run database. I think a lot of people may have concerns with that as well. I think that it's doable. I do believe that you've got to focus on ultimately the consumer and the ability for them to do what we keep talking about. I don't have an answer to that. I do know that the system is not working the way it is, and it's funny because there's a lot of enemies here, right? There are a lot of people to go after in this narrative. I have not been shy about going after Jamie Dimon or aggregators or certain fintech companies. Again, it goes back to I know this sounds kind of hokey, but the kumbaya moment of like, look, sit down in a room and figure it out. And I would argue if the biggest banks only negotiated with the biggest fintech companies to make it viable, I think that would be wrong as well, right? I think there was a lot of narrative around, this was a negotiating move, right? And behind the scenes, they're probably negotiating the best prices. That still leaves a lot of other players out of the conversation in terms of how this is all going to work. And so I don't think that works either. And if we think about ANPR and the process that literally just kicked off, the expedited process, that's just kicked off. I think oftentimes when government starts a process, and not to speak ill of the previous CFPB, but oftentimes when the government starts a process, there is sort of a place they're trying to get to. Not saying anything about anybody anywhere, but sometimes that is the case. I don't think that's the case here. I don't think anybody within the administration today knows what the answer is or how to sort of land this plane, where there's a lot of big, wealthy, big lobbying dollars behind a lot of sides of this, all with very, very deep pockets. And so I don't think there's a natural sort of conclusion in a way that's going to favor any one, because each one of the players that we've talked about that have come up all carry their own sort of weight and authority and ability to move the needle, and especially in an administration where, I think there's a little bit of unpredictability in terms of how things are going to play out. So, you saw kind of the CFPB sort of holding on, abandoning the lawsuit, and all of a sudden JP Morgan does what they do, and all of a sudden the CFPB says, hold off, we're going to step in and redo this process. I'm not sure at that point they said, okay, we have a clear pathway forward, only that we're going to do it, we're going to open it, it's going to have roundtables, and we're going to have people engaging. And so we're happy to be a part of that process, sort of with the first step, and I think interesting to see where it lands, because I don't know if anybody actually can. I've been asked this all day long. I don't think anybody knows sort of where it will land.
Did you have something you wanted to add?
I just want to say that the work that the American FinTech Council is doing is great because of this environment, right? It isn't settled law, and we don't have a rule, and we have billions of dollars worth of investment, which is attitudes about where this should go, and no one agrees with anyone. I will tell you one thing that's for absolutely certain, and that is that consumers own their data. They're the ones that transacted the business. If I buy a commodities contract, I know which 100 bushels of beans are mine. It can be traced all the way down to and through its commodities contract. There's no reason you can't commoditize consumer data. Consumers understand the value of letting institutions use their data for their betterment. That's not an argument. We know that. But we must understand that this idea that was hatched is not complete. We have work to do. Transferring data in itself is dangerous for the American consumer. Recontextualizing data outside of a regulated, examined environment is dangerous for the consumer. Lineage must transfer with the data in order for this industry to survive, and banks create that lineage. Now, keep this in mind. Banks create the lineage today. You create it tomorrow. So this isn't about the banks in the future. This is about what you do. But we need to make sure that consumers own their data, that consumers are in control of their data, and that there is no soft sale of their data without consent and without value. And we need to protect the American consumer in everything that we do. And there are markets that will be built from that perspective, I believe.
Well, so I was going to ask you guys, if you guys could write the 1033 rule yourselves, what would you put in it? So it sounds like you just gave a list of some of the things you would like. What would you two like to see in the new rule?
Two big ideas. Number one, there really should be two rules. But for the sake of just procedure, we can have it all under one rule. But it should be two mini rules. One involving payments and one involving actual data sharing. Really, those two use cases have nothing to do with each other. But for the sake of expediency, they were commingled a lot in the original rule, which led to a lot of confusion. And there's still a lot of people now. I still read a lot of articles now and see a lot of people talking about those use cases and kind of fumbling between the two as if they're the same thing when they're not. Moving money around is not the same thing as moving data around to help you underwrite yourself and get a better interest rate because you have a really good cash flow management in your bank account, or helping you set up a personal financial management dashboard where you can see all of your investment accounts. That has nothing to do with paying someone in Venmo. So really, those should be two completely separate rules. We're not going to talk a lot about payments today because this is about data sharing, so I'll put a pin in that one. On the data sharing piece, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to be a broken record, so I hope if you leave with anything, you leave remembering this, it should move from a system of static expectations based on your company vertical to dynamic expectations based on your role in the specific transaction and the value that you're either adding or extracting. And therefore, as Congressmember Frank said very succinctly, very eloquently, the price should be dictated by that willingness to pay. Now, is the CFPB going to create a price list? Of course not, right? We didn't do that in the prior administration. What makes you think that a Republican administration is going to be setting prices like that? That's not going to happen. But luckily, there were actually two rules passed last year. Okay, be honest. Raise your hand if you knew that CFPB passed two 1033 rules last year. Okay, nobody. The second one's the one you all know about. That's the big rule. That was in October. The first one was in June, and that was a rule that set the rules of the road for a standard setting body to come in and say, look, on behalf of all these institutions within the private sector, here are the formatting structure, and also here are the terms and rules of the road and when you can charge tolls and all this kind of stuff. And there was a lot put in there. And if people read it, they would actually see that the CFPB intentionally deferred a lot of power to those standard setting bodies, none of which has really stepped up and filled that void. The FTX is the closest to that. But if one could step up and say, we are going to be the system of lineage and value add, and we are going to determine, based on all of the expertise that we have from all of our members, how much a given transaction is worth on the open market, then we can set that price list almost like we're at a restaurant, and everybody can face that. And as Congressmember Frank just said, I promise I didn't even know this, he was going to say this ahead of time, you as the other party, the requesting party, can see that price and say, ooh, I want that filet mignon, or no, that's too expensive for me. I don't need that information. I'll find another way to get what I need.
The one thing I'll add, and I, again, appreciate sort of the expertise that both of these folks bring to it, is that things have shifted. And I think that, to me, is sort of what's critical. If you would have said to me 3 months ago, hey, if it opens up again, what are you going to do? It's like, hey, we'll probably look at the same letter, maybe make some nuances, make some adjustments of some of the things that we've learned, but generally be the same. I think that our next submission is going to look a bit different based on, I think, the dynamic shift that we have seen based on everything that's happened, not any one thing. And so I would say that, we were questioning what we can theoretically get done. We're a very pragmatic organization, right? We look at things as they are sometimes and say, we recognize sort of where the administration or where the agency is going. And so how do we move the needle a little bit? How do we bend it a little bit to sort of meet the needs of our members? That dynamic is radically shifted today. And so I think you're going to see more and more new ideas like the ones you've heard here come out in our next submission.
So I recently read the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and they basically raised some questions. And one of them I thought was kind of interesting about who represents the customer and what does it mean to represent the customer? And, I talk to people who work at banks, I talk to people who work at fintechs, I talk to people who work at data aggregators, and they all say, oh, all we want is what's in the customer's best interest. Like all we care about is the consumer. And, I would argue no one does. Everyone's out to make money for their business and, get the data as cheaply as they can and use it however they want to use it, hopefully without breaking any laws. But I would argue today, no one is representing the customer. So how would you answer that question?
You're a reporter who talks to banks and fintech companies all the time. And I literally got called out by one of your colleagues in a conversation saying that, like, well, it's in the best interest of creating consumer access to financial services. And she basically said, all right, stop. I don't want to hear that anymore because I hear that literally from everybody. The question becomes, and this sort of came up in the JPM debate, is where is the consumer getting the service? And I look, if anybody's ever heard me speak, you heard me talk about my daughter and the way in which she accesses her financial services, right? My daughter has never, ever, ever been into a bank branch ever. And yet she has accounts in 2 different banks. She has apps and accounts in probably 4 different fintech apps. So who represents her? It's the one she chooses to use. She has no idea what happens behind the scenes. She has no idea where the money's coming from, where the data is coming from, who's in the middle, who are the aggregators, who are the fintech companies, who are the compliance people. She has no idea. And so to me, she is making a conscious decision. I've helped a little bit, not too much, because she's smarter than me when it comes to this stuff, right? But she made a conscious decision to go with X, Y, or Z fintech company. She is now putting her faith and trust in that fintech company. Hopefully she did her due diligence and looked who's in the background, at least scroll to the fine print, who's their bank, right? Which means, to me, they hold, again, one level of that responsibility. At the same time, and this is going to sort of come out of the other side, is for 200 years, we've trusted banks and financial institutions with the integrity of protecting the system. And so, to me, there's a lot in the middle, right? So those are 2 sides of it. I think there's a piece on both of those. How they determine sort of who has to pay and who has to play in the middle, I think is the conversation, the debate we're having. But the bank, we talk about this a lot, the bank is responsible for regulatory, when it came to third-party risk management, right? Ultimately, as we saw in the last 3 years through the consent orders, the bank is responsible regardless. The consumer is choosing not the bank, the fintech company. I think both of those in some way, shape, or form share sort of the responsibility. And ultimately, sort of the consumer probably, if anything else, looks just at those two players in the middle. There's probably 50 more sort of people. And I think when we were seeing some of the third-party risk management, there was this idea of like, well, fourth-party risk management and fifth-party, and a vendor of a vendor of a vendor, and who is monitoring that, right? Those, again, there is sort of the chain of command, and there's two entities, I think, that are responsible, and I think they both need to own that responsibility. And I'll just say one thing. We represent both sides of the equation at the American FinTech Council. We hold our FinTech companies responsible to that same standards that we would expect from the bank. And so we think that the FinTech companies today, it's not, you're often going to hear, well, it's the Wild West of FinTech. It's not true. Right? There are more fintech companies today that have chief compliance officers and regulatory experts and general counsels that probably 10 years ago they didn't. You're seeing that evolution from the fintech ecosystem. And so to me, there's sort of that shared responsibility, and the two of them have to figure out how to deal with everything in the middle.
Is there anything from the October 2024 rule that was finalized that really should be preserved, in your opinion, Jim?
Well, I think we have an opportunity, and the opportunity doesn't lie within the words used to write the rule. The opportunity lies in the activity and investment we've seen in the industry anticipating the rule. You all built early. There ain't no rule. I don't know who your investors are, but there was no rule. And so now we that are writing the rule have to go and look at how badly we're going to hurt you if we don't do it the right way. That's nonsensical, right? So I understand the situation we're in, and I respect the position the Bureau is taking with these open comments in these 4 areas. But the purity of my heart is you built before the rule. And so if you get hurt by the final rule, your investors should have recognized the risk. I think we can do this. I think we can pull together and we can do this. In terms of third party, or in terms of the request that you were referring to earlier, consent is important to that, right? So, and authorization for those third-party requests to answer that part of that question. But I think we have an opportunity here to look at the industry agnostic to the investment that's been made already and see what's best for the American consumer. Now, I think that method will ultimately support the industry that's been built, because the industry that's been built has been conscious of what's best for the consumer. But I think it's important for the people that have their hand on the pen in Washington, D.C. writing this rule is to not write this rule to make sure Plaid's not pissed off, right? How bad's that going to look?
We've all been trying to avoid saying that name.
Right. So, and we want to make sure we don't write the rule to not make sure XYZ is mad. We want to write the rule that's in the best interest of the American consumer, that can ground and grow this industry into the future. And we'll laugh at ourselves in 10 years thinking about what we thought about, because this will take off. Once we give the authority and the ground rules and the playbook to the fintechs, it's done.
So I'm chomping at the bit, and I apologize because we're going to spice this up a little bit, because I disagree in that we have to wait for the... Think about having, and I say this to fintech companies and innovative ecosystem, like, oh, just wait until the rules and the regs are out there, then you'll build your company and you're going to be great, right? I mean, that is doing a disservice. There is a reason why fintech companies, look, if you want to go back to sort of post-Great Recession, right, where online lenders and marketplace lenders, or B2B, whatever they were called at the time, right, that has shifted over the years, stepped up when traditional financial institutions kind of fell down, were de-risking, and all of a sudden you found fintech innovators who stepped in to fill the void. There were no rules of the road, and they did the best they can to work with their bank partners, and those who did it right worked within the regulatory structure. But I can name you, look, you sort of folks that created things like buy now, pay later, or earned wage access, right? Like there is a number, and there's a number of innovators who have stepped in to create the service. Sadly, historically, as we've all seen, I say this as a recovering politician, sort of aspiring fintech executive, that like government, sadly, and regulators oftentimes don't move at the same pace as innovation. Innovators have to step up and kind of push the issue. Now, that doesn't mean, again, the old adage, right? Move quick and break things, right? If you do it responsibly with the partnership with your fintech companies, you do have a basic sense of the rules of the road. Now, oftentimes there are going to be sort of scenarios that are going to step up where there is really no rules of the road and you have to do the best you can. Well, then be a good actor, right? And I say this all the time, and I hate using the word good and bad because I'm not the one to make the determination who is good and who is bad. But if you're being a responsible actor and you're trying to create opportunities, I don't want to get all altruistic, to serve the consumer, then you're able to sort of figure out what is the cleanest pathway forward, trying to anticipate what would the regulation be if it were to come in.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the premature development and investment that took place. I absolutely don't think. I mean, there have been numerous times over the internet banking we anticipated what the rules would be and built that in an early stage too. I don't have an issue with that, but I do think I would like to see the people who had their hand on the pen be agnostic and not pressured by the industry. And do what's right for the American consumer.
All right, well,
That's easier to
a
happen
good
if it's a
note.
transaction level relationship rather than an entity level relationship. See, you're laughing. That means you've been listening. I said I'm repeating myself. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think I'm getting the vibe that we should wrap up. So thank you all so much for your views. A very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben.